The Arizona sun hung low over the crimson mesas, bleeding its last light across the dry horizon as the wind carried whispers of dust and danger through the canyons. Elias Turner rode with 3 other men, their horses weary, their tempers shorter than the desert shadows stretching ahead of them. For 2 weeks now, the settlers around San Pedro Creek had been restless. A series of livestock thefts and a burned barn had sparked whispers of Apache raiders. And though no one had seen them, fear had a way of inventing faces in the dark. Elias wasn't much for these manhunts. He was a trapper, not a soldier, but after Hank Rourke, the foreman from the Double R Ranch, banged on his door that morning talking about defending our people, Elias had saddled up. He told himself he was doing it to keep the peace, not to feed the mob's hunger for blood. The canyon was narrow, carved by centuries of wind, the ground a cracked patchwork of red and gold dust. Hank rode ahead, rifle across his saddle, eyes sharp. "Tracks lead west," he muttered, pointing to faint impressions in the dirt, small, barefoot prints, light but quick. Elias frowned. "Kid, maybe," he said. "Or a scout," Hank grunted, spitting into the sand. The others said nothing. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the creak of leather and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. They followed the tracks down to a stream barely trickling through the stones, and that's where they saw her alone figure crouched by the water, filling a small skin. Her hair was long, black as midnight, tied with beads that caught the last rays of sun. She couldn't have been more than 17. For a second, Elias thought she was a mirage, one of those desert ghosts the old miners whispered about. But when she turned, her eyes caught the light, sharp and real, and in that heartbeat everything changed. Hank hissed, "There!" And before Elias could stop him, he fired a warning shot. The echo thundered off the canyon walls, sending birds shrieking into the air. The girl froze, then darted backward into the stream, water splashing around her ankles. Elias jumped down, cursing, and ran forward before the others could fire again. "Hold your damn guns," he shouted. But she fought him with the fury of a wildcat, her small hands like claws, kicking and biting, her eyes filled with defiance, not fear. He managed to grab her wrists, twisting them behind her back as the others circled. She spoke something in Apache, low and sharp, words he couldn't understand but could feel like a curse whispered to the wind. "She's just a girl," Elias said breathlessly, holding her arms. "No weapon." Hank's jaw tightened. "Then she'll tell us what she's doing here." They tied her wrists with rawhide and set her on Elias's horse. As they rode back toward town, the sky turned purple, and the first stars flickered above the mesas. The girl sat behind Elias, her breath steady against his back, her silence heavier than chains. When they reached the village, lamps flickered to life in every window. People came out to see what the riders had brought back, men with rifles, women clutching children, all whispering the same word, Apache. Sheriff Maddox, a tall man with gray whiskers and a habit of squinting like he could see through lies, stepped forward. "Well now," he said slowly, "what do we have here?" Hank puffed up his chest. "Found her hidin' near the stream. Could be scouting for a raiding party." Elias dismounted and untied her. "She wasn't scouting," he said. "Didn't even try to run till you fired." The sheriff studied her a long moment, then turned to the crowd. "Anyone speak Apache?" Silence. Finally, old Calhoun, the trader who'd lived among tribes for years, stepped out. He said something to her in her tongue. The girl looked at him once, then turned her gaze to the mountains, refusing to answer. Calhoun frowned. She understands, he said quietly, but she won't talk. Then she'll sit in the lockup till she does, Maddox said. The crowd murmured, uneasy, half curious, half cruel. They wanted to believe she was dangerous. Sit made their fear feel justified. As the sheriff led her away, Elias caught her eyes again. There was something strange in them, not pleading, not hatred, but knowledge. A knowing that cut deep. That night, as the desert cooled and the moon rose silver over the plains, Elias lay awake in his cabin. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks, like a song he almost recognized. He kept seeing her face, the defiance in her eyes, the way she'd looked at him when he caught her, as if she were seeing not him, but what he'd become. Something in his chest twisted, an ache he couldn't name. The others would celebrate their capture tomorrow, raise whiskey to it. But Elias couldn't, because deep down, he knew something about this night was wrong. And though he couldn't yet name it, he felt the warning in his bones that this wasn't the end of trouble. It was the beginning. The night in San Pedro settled heavy. The kind of desert silence that wasn't quiet at all, but filled with 1,000 whispers, the hiss of wind across sand, the creak of old wood, the rustle of dry grass. The captured Apache girl was locked in the old livery barn behind the sheriff's office, her hands still bound, her shadow flickering against the lantern light like some restless spirit. Elias Turner stood outside, hat in hand, trying to make sense of the ache in his chest. He'd done what the others expected brought her in, kept his head down, but he couldn't shake the thought that something about her capture felt wrong, as if he'd just disturbed something sacred. Inside, the girl sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, staring at the wall, her face unreadable. Sheriff Maddox had tried to question her earlier, his voice sharp with authority, but she hadn't spoken a word. Calhoun had come by too, murmuring gentle phrases in Apache, telling her no one meant her harm, but she'd looked past him like a ghost, her eyes fixed on the open sliver of sky through the loft window. The sheriff eventually gave up, muttering that she'd talk by morning. They always do, he'd said. But Elias wasn't so sure. He leaned on the rail, watching her through the slats. The lantern's glow painted her face in gold and shadow. There was pride there, yes, but also sorrow, and something deeper still. A calm that didn't belong to a prisoner. She knew something the rest of them didn't. The next morning, before sunrise, the town buzzed with talk. Some said the Apaches would come to take her back. Others claimed she was a scout who'd bring vengeance upon them by nightfall. Fear spread faster than truth in a place like San Pedro. Elias walked to the barn, boots crunching over the frost-hardened dirt. The air smelled of smoke and horses, the sky washed pale blue. He pushed open the door quietly, expecting her to still be asleep, but she was awake, sitting by the stall door, eyes open, watching him like she'd been waiting. For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the soft shift of sand outside. "You're not gonna talk to anyone, are you?" he said finally. No response. He sighed and crouched beside her. "Look, I don't want trouble. I just don't want anyone hurt." She tilted her head, studying him like she was deciding what kind of man he really was. Then, slowly, she spoke just one word, rough from disuse. "Why?" Elias blinked. "Why what?" She didn't answer, only looked at the rope around her wrists, then back at him. Shame burned in him. He loosened the knot a little. "There, that's all I can do," he said softly. "They're watchin'." She said something then, a low murmur in her language, almost like a prayer, and pointed toward the mountains. Elias didn't understand, but the weight of it made his stomach twist. She was warning him of something, that much he could tell. He stood, unsure of what to do next. The barn door creaked behind him, and Sheriff Maddox stepped in, squinting. "You feedin' her now, Turner?" he asked. "Just checkin' she's all right," Elias said quickly. The sheriff smirked. "You're gettin' soft. She'll have plenty to say once the sun's high. Folks are scared, and scared folks need answers." He left without waiting for a reply. Elias turned back to the girl, but she'd gone still again, her eyes back on that strip of sky. By noon, half the town had gathered near the barn. Men with rifles leaned against the fence, muttering about raids, about how the Apaches never left one of their own behind. Elias tried to calm them, saying it was just talk, but their fear was louder than reason. Then, as the sun climbed, something strange happened. A wind swept down from the mountains, cold and sudden, stirring the dust into small whirlwinds that danced across the ground. The horses grew restless, snorting and stamping. The sheriff came running from the office, shouting, "The girl's gone." The door to the barn hung open, the ropes cut clean, but there were no footprints, only the swirl of dust and a faint scent of sage carried on the wind. The villagers panicked, shouting that she'd vanished like a spirit. Elias stood frozen, his pulse hammering. He didn't believe in ghosts, but what he saw next chilled him all the same. On the ground where she'd been sitting was a mark drawn in the Durtan Apache symbol. Rough but deliberate. He crouched down, touching the symbol with trembling fingers. Calhoun came up behind him, pale. "That means they're coming," the old man whispered. "For her, or for us." Elias looked toward the mountains, their peaks shrouded in haze. He thought he saw movement there, dark shapes shifting in the sunlight, though maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. But in his heart, he knew better. The girl's silence hadn't been defiance, it had been prophecy. Whatever she'd whispered in her language that morning wasn't a curse. It was a warning no one had wanted to hear. And now it was too late. The day after the girl vanished, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The wind had gone still, the sky a flat pale blue, and even the coyotes stayed silent beyond the ridge. Elias Turner hadn't slept since she disappeared. Every sound, every creak of the windmill made him flinch. The townsfolk gathered in the square, restless and whispering, eyes darting toward the mountains, as though the horizon itself had turned hostile. Sheriff Maddox barked orders, sent riders in all directions, and cursed under his breath when they came back empty-handed. "Ain't no one can vanish like that," he muttered. "Not unless someone helped her." And though he didn't say the name aloud, everyone's gaze drifted toward Elias. He'd been the one closest to her, the one who'd spoken for mercy. "I didn't help her," Elias said quietly, but his voice didn't carry far. They didn't believe him, not really. Fear had already written the story they wanted to hear. That afternoon, he saddled his horse and rode toward the canyon where they'd first found her, hoping for a sign, any trace of where she'd gone. The ground was scorched dry, littered with tumbleweeds and bones bleached white by the sun. Then, near the stream, he saw it, a single footprint pressed into the mud, small and delicate, leading toward the mountains. But beside it, etched into the sand, was another mark, strange and looping, like a spiral cut by wind. He knelt, brushing the dust aside. It wasn't a symbol he knew, but he felt the same chill he'd felt that first night, like eyes watching him from beyond sight. A shadow passed overhead. He looked up and saw a hawk circling low, crying once before it vanished into the sun. He followed the tracks for hours, through thornbrush and red stone, until the land rose and the air grew thinner. At the crest of the ridge he found something else, still warm, and the faint smell of smoke. Someone had camped there recently. He crouched, fingers sifting through the remains, and found a bead small, carved from bone, painted with the same pattern he'd seen woven into her hair. "You're alive," he whispered. But as he stood, he heard another sound, hoofbeats, far off. He turned and saw riders coming fast from the town, rifles glinting in the sunlight. Hank Rourke led them, his face red with anger. "You think you can lead us in circles?" he shouted as they approached. "You been out here talking to ghosts?" Elias clenched his jaw. "I found where she went. You found trouble, that's what," Hank spat. "Sharif says if she's with a raiding party, we strike first." The men nodded, eager, afraid, desperate to believe that shooting first would make them safe. Elias tried to protest, but Hank pushed past him, following the tracks up toward the ridge. That's when the wind shifted sudden, strong, carrying with it the scent of sage and smoke again, thicker this time. The horses reared, whinnying, and a sound echoed through the canyon, not human, not quite animal, like a cry pulled from the earth itself. The riders froze. Dust lifted around them, swirling in spirals that shimmered with light before fading back into the air. "What in God's name?" one man whispered. Then came the arrows. They struck the dirt near their feet first, a warning more than a kill, but the message was clear. Shapes appeared along the ridge, dark figures, still and silent, watching. The Apaches had come. Hank raised his rifle, but Elias grabbed his arm. "Don't," he said. "They don't want blood yet." Hank yanked free, furious, but before he could fire, one of the riders screamed. His horse bolted, throwing him down the slope. Chaos broke loose. The Apaches didn't attack. They vanished like smoke, gone before the dust even settled. Elias turned toward the ridge, and for a moment he saw Hertha, girl standing among the rocks, her hair lifted by the wind, eyes locked on him. Then she raised her hand, pointing toward the town below. The gesture wasn't anger, it was warning. And just as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone again, swallowed by the heat shimmer. The men shouted, panicked, accusing Elias of witchcraft, of treachery. But he barely heard them. His pulse thundered in his ears, and her words from the barn came back to him, the tone more than the meaning. Something was coming. That night, when he returned to San Pedro, the sky was dark with clouds that didn't belong to the desert, thick, heavy, trembling with distant thunder. The townsfolk gathered their children, barred their doors. Elias stood in the empty street, the wind rising around him, carrying dust that twisted and danced in strange patterns. When he looked down, he saw the spiral, again drawn by the dust itself, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The omen was no longer just in the mountains. It was here, in the heart of the village, whispering the same message the girl had tried to tell him. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. The wind came first dry, strange, restless, rolling down from the mountains like a whisper that didn't belong to the desert. By dusk, the air was thick with dust and dread, and the skies above San Pedro were bruised purple, trembling with thunder. The town's single street, usually filled with lazy chatter and the sound of boots on wood, had gone quiet. Doors were barred, lamps were dimmed, and people spoke only in half-breaths, as if the very air might be listening. Elias Turner stood alone outside the sheriff's office, hat pulled low, coat snapping in the wind. He'd felt storms before, but nothing like this. The air itself seemed alive, charged with a power that made the hair on his arms stand up. "It's just weather," Sheriff Maddox muttered beside him, trying to sound sure, though his hand rested nervously on the revolver at his belt. Elias didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the horizon where the mesas rose black against the sky, remembering the girl's gaze and the warning he'd seen in it. The wind carried the scent of rain and something else beneath it, faint but sharp, like smoke and sage. By nightfall, lightning began to crawl across the clouds in silent flashes, lighting the town in bursts of white. The preacher came out of the church, Bible in hand, and called for prayer. Few came. Most stayed behind locked doors, whispering about omens, curses, and the Apache girl who had vanished like a spirit. Earlier that morning, someone had found her symbol again scratched into the wood of the church door. That same spiral carved deep enough to bleed sap. No one had seen who did it, but everyone knew. "She brought this down on us," someone had hissed at Elias in the saloon. And though he'd said nothing, guilt gnawed at him like a worm in his gut. As the night deepened, the storm broke loose. Wind tore through the town with a howl like something alive, ripping shingles from rooftops and snapping fence rails. Rain followed thick, heavy, unrelenting, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. Thunder cracked above like the sky itself had split open. Elias fought against the wind, stumbling through the downpour toward the old barn where the girl had been kept. The door banged wildly against the wall, the same door that once held her behind it. He stepped inside, rain dripping from his coat, and froze. The lantern he'd left, cold and empty, now burned on its own, its flame steady despite the wind. The smell of smoke filled the air, mingling with wet straw and earth. On the floor, drawn in the mud, was the spiral again, fresh, perfect, glowing faintly in the light. "No," he whispered. "This ain't possible." A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him, and the lantern flared brighter for a heartbeat. In that light, for just an instant, he saw her standing where the shadows met the wall. Eyes like embers, hair glistening with rain. She didn't speak, but her gaze was clear and fierce, not anger, not vengeance. Then, lightning struck close enough to shake the ground, and she was gone. Elias stumbled backward, heart pounding, tripping into the mud as the door burst open again and voices shouted outside. Sheriff Maddox and Hank Rourke came running through the storm, their coats plastered to their backs. "You see it too," Maddox yelled over the rain. Elias pointed to the floor, but the symbol was gone, washed away by the flood pouring through the open door. Only the mud remained, swirling in circles as if mocking him. Hank spat. "Damn superstition," he growled. "That girl's long gone, and we're here chasing shadows." But as he turned to leave, lightning lit up the hills beyond the town nan there. Through the rain, tiny fires burned in a long, wavering line. Riders. Elias's breath caught. "They're here," he whispered. The sheriff followed his gaze and swore under his breath. "Get the people inside." Bells rang through the wind, the preacher shouting prayers lost to thunder. Children cried, women huddled near the church, men grabbed rifles they barely knew how to use. Elias stood in the center of it all, soaked and shaking, the storm whipping around him like fury made flesh. He could feel something rising in the earth, a pulse, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the desert itself. The rain slowed, just for a moment, and in that strange, quiet pause between thunder, he heard her voice again, not from the mountains, not from the wind, but inside his head. "You were warned." Lightning struck the bell tower, sending sparks through the night, and the sky opened once more in a roar of rain and fire. The Apaches came like ghosts through the storm, their torches flickering against the dark, their silhouettes shifting through the sheets of water. Elias didn't reach for his gun. He just stood there, drenched and trembling, watching the past and the present crash together in the storm she had promised. And somewhere between the thunderclaps, as fire met rain, he understood what she had meant all along. San Pedro wasn't being punished by her people. It was being judged by its own fear. The storm didn't end with the coming of dawn. It simply changed its shape. The rain eased, but the wind kept howling, sweeping ash and broken branches down the single muddy street of San Pedro. Smoke hung in the air from lightning-struck roofs, the town smelling of wet earth and fear. From the ridgeline above, a slow line of riders descended, shadows against the pale morning, their torches burning steady despite the wind. The townspeople gathered at the windows, silent, watching as the figures came closer. No one spoke until the first hoof struck the edge of town. The sound echoed like a drum. Elias Turner stood beside Sheriff Maddox in the street, his rifle hanging useless at his side. He could feel the same pulse in the ground that he'd felt all through the night, deep and rhythmic, as though the earth itself were breathing with the riders. The lead horse stepped into view, painted in streaks of white clay and ash, its rider tall and lean, his face marked in red and black. Around his neck hung a circle of bone beads, the same pattern Elias had seen woven in the girl's hair. She was with them, riding just behind, wrapped in a blanket of crimson, her dark hair plastered to her shoulders by rain. When she looked at him, there was no hatred in her eyes, only something unreadable, sorrow maybe, or resolve. Sheriff Maddox raised his hand. "We don't want trouble," he shouted, his voice trembling. The Apache leader didn't answer. He dismounted slowly, planted his torch upright in the mud, and spoke in his own tongue, the words low and measured. Calhoun, the old trader, stepped forward to translate, his voice barely a whisper. He says, "They came for the girl. She was taken without cause." And he says the storm was the warning. Maddox swallowed. "She's free now." She left. The leader's gaze hardened. More words followed, sharper this time. Calhoun's face went pale. "He says freedom means nothing when taken by force. He says you must give something back." The sheriff's grip on his gun tightened, but Elias moved first, stepping between them. "What do you want?" he called. The leader's eyes met his. "Balance," Calhoun murmured. "He says balance must be restored." The wind rose again, sweeping through the torches so that their flames bent eastward, toward the church. The girl dismounted, her feet sinking into the mud. She walked past everyone, past the guns, the fear. The trembling Menon stopped in front of Elias. Up close, she looked different, not wild, not broken, just human and tired. She raised her hand and placed something in his palm, a single bead, carved from bone, painted with that same spiral. Then she spoke softly, words that even Calhoun didn't translate. Elias didn't need him to. He understood. She was asking him to end the cycle. Behind her, the riders waited, unmoving. The storm had turned to mist now, curling around their horses' legs like smoke. Maddox shouted again, demanding they leave, but no one moved. Elias looked down at the bead, then at the faces of his neighbors, hiding behind doors. Guns pointed at people they didn't understand. He felt the weight of every choice that had led here. Slowly, he walked to the center of the street, lifted the bead to the sky, and let it fall into the mud. "No more," he said quietly. The girl watched him, then nodded once. She turned back to her people, spoke a few words, and the riders began to move silent, graceful, vanishing back into the veil of mist, as though the earth itself swallowed them. When the last hoofbeat faded, the wind died too, leaving San Pedro drenched and stunned beneath a pale sun. The church bell, cracked from the lightning, gave one hollow ring and fell silent. Elias stood alone, the mud cooling around his boots, the spiral bead half buried at his feet. Somewhere far off, thunder rumbled again, but it sounded softer now, almost like a sigh. The storm had taken what it wanted. Balance, for the moment, had been restored. The storm had passed, but San Pedro had not healed. The clouds drifted west, leaving the desert washed clean and strange, its colors too bright, its silence too deep. The air smelled of wet dust and burnt pine, and though the sun returned, the warmth it brought felt hollow. Days turned slow, like the town itself was holding its breath, unsure of what to do now that the fury of the heavens had gone quiet. The people worked to mend what the storm had taken. The bell tower rebuilt, the fences lifted, the church dried and scrubbed clean, but something invisible had shifted in them. They spoke softer, walked slower, and when the wind rose in the afternoons, even a little, they fell silent and listened. Elias Turner spent most of his time near the edge of town, fixing the windmill that no one else cared to mend. The others said he was haunted, and maybe he was. Sometimes, when the wind changed, he swore he could still hear the girl's voice in it, light as dust and gone before he could catch the words. The bead she had given him, the one that carried the spiral, remained buried where it fell that night in the mud, but he could not forget the weight of it, nor the pulse he had felt through the earth. Some nights he'd dig for it, hands raw, heart thudding, but the desert had swallowed it whole, as if claiming what was always its own. Sheriff Maddox had aged 10 years in 10 days, his once booming voice gone hoarse with regret. He'd stopped wearing his badge, and his revolver stayed on the desk now, untouched. "I thought we were keeping the peace," he told Elias once, eyes fixed on the horizon. "But maybe all we ever did was break it." The preacher left without a sermon. The trader packed his things. Half the saloon chairs sat empty each night. The world was quieter now, and the quiet hurt. One evening, as the sun bled down behind the mesas, Elias saw something glimmer on the ridge, a flicker of light that didn't belong to fire or star. He followed it past the last fence, through the shallow creek that still carried a thin thread of storm water, and into the desert beyond. The air cooled as the sky turned violet, and the sound of his boots softened against the sand. That's when he saw her. The Apache girl stood in the distance, wrapped in the same crimson blanket she'd worn when she rode away. Her hair moved with the wind, long and dark and free. For a moment, Elias thought she was only a mirage, some ghost of guilt conjured by moonlight. But then she turned her head, and he saw the glint of her eyes, alive and knowing. He stopped a few steps away. "You came back," he said, his voice breaking on the words. She didn't answer at first. She looked out toward the horizon, where the storm had once come from, and then down at the sand between them. "The desert keeps what men forget," she said softly. Her voice was steady, calm, but it carried weight, like the wind itself bent to listen. The storm was not anger, it was memory. Your people forgot how to listen. Elias swallowed hard. "And now?" he asked. She reached into her blanket and drew out a beadon of a spiral. This one carved from pale bone, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Now it remembers you," she said, holding it out. When he hesitated, she stepped closer, her hand steady, her eyes gentle but fierce. "You carry it, or the land will." He took it, his fingers brushing hers, and the moment he did, he felt it again, the heartbeat underfoot, deep and slow, like the pulse of something ancient and alive. "What am I supposed to do with it?" he asked. The girl smiled faintly. "Learn," she said. "Tell them what the storm told you." Then she turned away, her figure fading with each step until she was only a shadow against the dunes, and then not even that. The wind shifted, brushing past Elias like a whisper, and the bead warmed in his palm. He looked down at it. The spiral seemed to move, turning ever so slightly, like it was alive. He stood there until dawn, watching the desert breathe beneath the first light of morning. When he finally returned to San Pedro, no one asked where he'd gone. He went straight to the church, placed the bead in the cracked wooden altar, and whispered a promise that only the desert could hear. The days that followed were different. The windmills turned again, the wells filled deeper. Children laughed where silence once reigned. Sometimes, at dusk, Elias would look to the horizon and see dust rising. But no riders came, only the wind, curling through the canyons like a song. And every time it passed through town, it carried that same rhythm, the one he had first heard in the storm, the heartbeat of the land, slow, patient, eternal. He never saw the girl again, but he felt her everywhere, in the rain that smelled of sage, in the fire that never burned the same way twice, in the sound of thunder rolling, gentle and far. He understood then that balance wasn't something you found once and kept. It was something you had to earn, again and again, by listening. And so he did. Long after San Pedro's name faded from maps and memory, the story of the storm remained. They said it came when men stopped listening and left only when they remembered who they were beneath the sky.